Hello and welcome to another edition of Another Book Review. This week I'll review David Leonhardt's latest work, Ours Was the Shining Future. I'll talk very briefly about the author, go into an overview of what the book is about, talk about what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, and what I will be reading for next time. I'm going to try out a microphone to see if this sound is a little bit better. I know some of the sound for the last few videos has been kind of rough because I was using the internal mic, so hopefully this will be a little bit better. If not, we'll try something different. David Leonhardt is a writer for the New York Times. He does some of their podcasts as well. He has been a host for a couple of events at Politics and Prose. You can check those videos out on YouTube at their bookstore in DC. He's written a couple of other books as well. He's kind of known for being I'd say he's pretty squarely on the left, which is pertinent to this book because it is a look at the rise and fall of the American dream from roughly the New Deal to today, and looks at the policies and the people that have led to a widening income inequality and ways that David thinks that we can return to more of a shared, broader prosperity that he calls the democratic capitalism is what the term he uses. So the book is pretty long, but it is pretty good at making its points that he's making. He uses some pretty good statistics in there. He uses the people he covers. He covers a lot of people. He covers Betty Friedan, A. Philip Randolph, the AFL-CIO leaders, Mitt Romney's father, has a long section on Robert Bork and RFK, and basically shows how each of them kind of either played into this idea of democratic capitalism or worked against it. And it's well researched. He has his points laid out. And so that's the book. There are some cons about the book, the writing itself. I thought he doesn't use a ton of tables, but the tables and graphs he uses, I didn't think on the ebook that I read were particularly clear. And so that irked me, given how very few of them, he could have just gotten away with not using them at all. So that's the book is basically the story of the rise and fall, some things about the modern day, and then finally a chapter on two chapters on the problems of America today, one of which is immigration. And then there's kind of a grab bag chapter, which is basically everything that David doesn't like about the current system. And then what he proposes to rectify this situation. It's kind of like an 11th chapter, as Richard Reeves would say. It's like you wrote all this book, and then there's the 11th chapter where you fix everything. So my biggest issue with the book, there's two big issues with the book. One is I think it is quite long. I'm not someone who particularly loves history. There's a couple of stories in there that I thought were interesting. The story of Dwight D. Eisenhower and kind of the convoy across the country and how that planted the seeds for the interstate highway system. I thought that was an interesting story. But most of the rest of the stuff I could have given or taken. And so the problem I had with this book is very, very similar to another book I read, which is The Last Best Hope by George Packard. And that's a much shorter book. In that book, George Packard basically said, there's four ideologies in America. There's the libertarian ideology epitomized by the Reagan Revolution, which David talks a lot about in this book. There's real America, which is closer to the social conservatives or the Donald Trump wing of the Republican Party. There is the meritocracy of Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. And then there's kind of what he calls woke America. Those are his terms, which is kind of the social justice movement of the wing of the Democratic Party, and how those four different ideologies kind of battle for political control of the country. And George Packard in his book has kind of a last chapter where he tries to find a way to kind of amalgamate that into a policy or an ideology that works for more people. So that's basically what he does in a much shorter book. And George Packard in his book does have some historical people that he covers in a very similar way to David Leonhardt, but his book is much shorter, and it kind of gets in and gets out. And so there's nothing necessarily wrong with David Leonhardt's book. I mean, there are people who would have quibbles with some of what he says. I think there's a long chapter on immigration that could have been shortened. I think the AFL-CIO stuff could have been cut. I think there are probably people who would defend the Reagan Revolution who would bring different data to David to talk about, and David acknowledges that you needed some deregulation here. So it was a question of how much deregulation and what should the marginal tax rate have been and kind of all these things. And I think David at times gives people way too much political credit for things that happened years and years and years after they've left office. You basically given them credit for this thing where it's like, does no one have any agency after they become the president? But all that being said, my biggest issue with the book is the length. I thought that there were times where I could have gotten on board with a lot of his things. I don't necessarily have anything. I'm not pro or con union, so if you want to make arguments for unions, I wish he had spent more time talking about how the economy of the 1930s and 40s is different than the economy today. He doesn't really do that. I wish he had spent more time calling for really clear policies on education. He doesn't really do that. I wish he had spent more time for the immigration policy. He has kind of half of a policy, but doesn't have a full policy of how many immigrants he would actually let into the country. He basically just says we should let more immigrants in who have skills to make the white-collar workers angry and not the blue-collar workers. So I wasn't really a huge fan of that either, especially if you're not going to give me a number of how many people we're talking about. So I didn't love that part of it. And I thought a lot of the wishful thinking, including making DC and Puerto Rico a state, I think is much more controversial than David makes it out to be. And I think that I've never seen any polling that gives it like clear majority popularity with the American people. So I say all that to say, I thought in general, I enjoyed it while I was reading it. I don't know how much I'll think about it. If someone was to ask me to read a book on this subject, there are many that I've read. Adrift is very similar to this book. He mentions Thomas Piketty's Capitalism in the 21st Century, the George Packard book. So I would probably recommend those before this one. I maybe would recommend this before Capitalism in the 21st Century if they were really concerned about why things have changed. I think in David Leonhardt's defense, he does call out things where he makes a point to give alternative explanations for things at some times in the book. So he does make a point to say, well, during this 30-year period of the post-World War baby boom, America was really the only country that was able to make advanced goods, which also means that it needed a labor force, and that means that the people who owned factories were probably much more tolerant to unions than they would have otherwise been. He also points out in a later chapter that the immigration levels at that point were also quite low because of these events, and that also is going to play into it. So I don't know how much I buy that it's not always a fight between the capitalists and the laborers. I tend to think that it's always a fight between the capitalists and the laborers. He says, well, there's cultural differences at times where there are capitalists who are at times much more willing to take less money, and there's times where their laborers are willing to make deals where they don't. And so he makes nods to it, but there are times where I just question if he really gives full weight to some of those issues. So I would have liked I would have liked a full book of like the last 4 chapters. There are times where I think he's usually okay with the statistics, other than, he talks about percentage of GDP, and he says, well, he calls out, we're spending 2% of GDP on prisons, and he calls out that we're spending a ton of money on healthcare, but he doesn't call out the 15% of money that we're spending just to pay for the debt, which is going to make a lot of this difficult. And he doesn't really talk about an honest way to get like all this investment without like sorting that out. And so I was kind of irked by that. He doesn't really get into military spending, which is also a huge part of the budget. I think he does have kind of at least the courage to call out Social Security and say we need to make changes to Social Security and Medicare because we're spending too much on poor people, spending too much money on the elderly to the exclusion of young people. He seems to be a huge fan of Obamacare. That's also, I think, a pretty large subsidy for people who in a healthy working economy should be able to get health care from their employers, but that's another story for another day. Overall, if someone asked me, would you recommend this book? I would say if you hadn't read Last Best Hope, you should read this, or Adrift. I think Adrift is also a pretty good book if I was looking for someone to get like the general gist. If someone was like a history buff and like really loved the history and wanted like this version of the story, then I could recommend the book, because I think it's not like terribly written. It's pretty easy to follow. It's just, to me, it's a lot of uninteresting stories at times. There were some that were interesting, but a lot of it was like uneven. And part of me just wanted to kind of flip through it, and I would have probably cut 20 to 30% of the stories. I would have probably asked him to talk more about the Reagan Revolution and some more of the counterexamples than the ones he gives to his kind of conclusion. He kind of just flippantly says, well, ask people if they like the economy. And I think if you ask people what their lives would be like without technology, would it be better or worse? I don't think they'd be able to give you a clear answer. And so some of that is the cost. He kind of points to income being down. Most people don't realize when they've saved money because costs would have been higher. So you do have things like the iPhone, which if you look at it and broken it down in like 1980s, prices would have been astronomically higher than the value it is now. But anyway, it's kind of irrelevant to the point I'm trying to make. But I wish there had been more of that. I wish he had spent more time on maybe the last 2 or 3 chapters and given himself more time to talk about this stuff. He spends a lot of time talking about transportation and like the lack of progress in travel in a way that it felt kind of out of place. But there are definitely people who will like this. And if you haven't read that book or similar books, then you may enjoy this. I felt that it suffered in comparison to those other books that I've read, which are a little bit shorter and kind of easier to make their point. But the book, for what it was, I enjoyed it for the most part. Ours Was the Shining Future by David Leonhardt. If you're a history person and you like reading history from the 1910s, he has I'd say the first 20 to 25% of the book is about the labor movement in Minneapolis. If that's something that interests you, then you're going to like this book. If you're not someone who wants to read 50 or 60 pages on the labor movement, then this is probably not the book for you. You can probably get like a shorter. The Last Best Hope, the good thing about that book, it basically starts in the 80s and then it talks about today and doesn't go back much further than that. Because if you're living in today, he kind of is able to tie those things together. This book very much makes a point to go back and explain the history leading up to these things. And so that's really the main difference between the two books. I know George Packard wrote a review of this book. I look forward to reading that review after this video to see what he says about Ours Was the Shining Future, to see how he contrasts his book with Leonhardt's book, because they are very, very similar. And they're calling for really pretty similar proposals. I don't think Leonhardt goes as far to call for universal college or for a Green New Deal that Packard does call for, but they're covering very similar topics and areas of discussion. Ours Was a Shining Future. If you have read this book, let me know if there's something about it that you really did enjoy that I missed. I imagine this is a book that some people are going to like more than others. I imagine this is a book that a lot of people get a couple of pages through or a quarter through and just go, I can't get to the end, because it is a lot of stories. And to me, it's just more of what I would like to know. I'm less interested about historical people than I am about like the live today. And so that may be part of why wasn't as attracted to it as much. Next time, Zadie Smith, The Fraud. Until next time, if you have enjoyed this video, please like the video. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you could hear better on this video, also let me know. If it sounded better, I would appreciate that. And I'll have my Twitter link below. I'll have links to Adrift. Ours Was the Adrift. The 2 Richard Reeves books that cover similar ground. I don't have the George Packard book video, unfortunately, and Thomas Piketty. I'll have that there too, because these all kind of cover similar ground to this book. And if you like this one, you'll probably also like those. Till next time, bye.